So I'm Sarah Groff-Palermo. You can find me on Twitter at SuperSGP, and I'm a designer who actually taught myself to code so that I could make basically all of the weird things that I like to imagine. And today I'm going to be talking to you about art, which is not a library or a framework. It's actually about the craft of making art with JavaScript and data, what I like to call data art. And so we're not really going to cover a whole bunch of like code or this is how you should write it, because you are all very smart, creative people who I trust to go out and find the answers. I'll talk a little bit about some of the materials used in the examples, but mostly we're going to look at a whole bunch of examples and hopefully get you excited to make some data art. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about process. Another keynote, which is about using the word art. A lot of people decide that art means one thing or another thing, and they like to get drunk with their friends and argue about it, and I highly recommend doing that. It's one of the best parts about being an artist is getting drunk and arguing with your friends. But for today, because I want lots of people to start doing this, I'm going to go with the biggest and broadest definition of art, which is to just say that if you explore things you like and you experiment and you make something and you stick it out there and you say that this is art, then it's art, and nothing else that anybody else has to say about it matters in the slightest. So those are all of my caveats. Now I'm going to start a little bit with defining my terms. What is data art? How does it differ from data visualization? Is it just pretty data visualization? So to start answering the question about the distinction, I actually have to start with what they have in common, which is to say that both are about the investigation of information. And while they go about those investigations somewhat differently, you know, maybe one is more of a Sherlock Holmes and one is more of a Columbo about it, at heart, their structure is set up around the kinds of information we classify as data, which is to say information that can be structured to be dealt with algorithmically. So whereas the materials are the same, the methods are distinguishable. The types of data each works with, its goals, and the types of expression used to sort of achieve these goals. The first spread is between the kinds of data, covering a spectrum from comprehensive on the one hand to fragmented on the other. And when we say comprehensive, you can think about traditional data visualization. It's organized around an ideal of a data set that is comprehensive and as unbiased as possible. And plenty of data visualizers will tell you they never get that kind of data set, but it's the goal in an ideal world. And then, you know, what you would do is you'd pull together all of this data and no field would be missing and all the related quantifiable metrics would be available. And then once you gathered all of these numbers together, we'd pull the best patterns and stories from that collection. And that's what we'd show. Data art, on the other hand, wants the opposite kind of data set. The ideal data set is small, it's fragmented, it's incomplete. It should be personal or at the very least something human. And we're using different kinds of data sets, of course, because the goals are different. Both want to communicate, but what are they communicating? On the one hand, data visualization's goal is to communicate that information that it's investigating. It wants to tell you what is known, what they've found. On the other hand, data art is to communicate an experience, to express a thing we know through living, much as a novel might. So you could say they want to express what they've felt. And the third goal is the third difference is the type of expression, as you would imagine with such different goals and different data sets, right? So this is a very standard, a very good, but very standard data visualization from the New York Times. It has a really high pixel to information density ratio. You know, you can see each data point. It's a little bit light up there, but there's little dots behind everything. And you can see each data point, they've pulled out the story that they want to tell you. But if you wanted to know what anything was, you could probably hover over it and find the number and the date. And, you know, it's really about getting down to precision. Data art, on the other hand, is a lot like this work by Lori Frick, which is called Nightly Sleep Analyzed. And here these squares represent the x-axis, the implied x-axis is how much sleep she's had. And the squares with their size and their color cover traveling. So you can sort of see how much traveling has affected sleep. And in the end, it seems like not very much, but really what you're getting is the experience of Lori's life. You can see that, you know, at the end of the year, everything got wild and she went everywhere and it was fun and exciting versus the quietness at the beginning. And so that's really what this art is communicating to us. And we'll see in some examples, finally, some data art is not even visual at all, or far less visual, and it's still, of course, art. So that's what data art is. And you might then wonder, why is it awesome? Why should you undertake it? And I have 4 very quick reasons. I like lists. There will be a lot of them in this. So we like to do it to understand ourselves, to understand the systems to which we are subject and to which we subject others, to expand our horizons in terms of the kind of visualization we're doing and work we do with data. And 4th, of course, because it's fun. And I put that last because it's important, right? I can stand up here and tell you that understanding yourself is very important, and experimenting and making pretty things is awesome, and I believe all of those things. But if it's not fun, then there's sort of no point in doing it at all, I don't think. So let's talk about understanding ourselves. This is where I sort of start and say a couple of cliches that I think are really important. We live in a time of accelerating technical change. I think we all know that. And as programmers, we get to be at the heart of a lot of it. But if our tools are changing quickly, as humans, we change perhaps somewhat less, and probably less than the possibilities that are available. But if we, the people who are shaping the interaction of technology with others, are only those who are most excited about it, we can end up with a lopsided and constrained implementation that doesn't do justice to everyone. And that's actually a risk that we run. Science and tech have their own biases, including assumptions about objectivity of data and code that are really hard to critique within their own systems. The way they talk about themselves in the scientific method, for instance, precludes it. And when you focus only on the kind of truth that traditional data orbits around, quantifiable, observable, direct, you privilege that kind of knowledge as the most true, and you privilege the concerns of engineers as the most important, forgetting some of the, soft things that are unimportant or easy to brush under the rug. Meanwhile, the humanities, particularly history and literature, have as their project placing human activities into context and then systematically criticizing them in pursuit of understanding. If they merely turn up their noses at tech, they abandon their own mission. But combined, the two develop awesome superpowers, making up for each other's shortfalls and opening a window into who we were before the web and who we will continue to be without it. And when we do this, we understand ourselves as we are today and make good decisions for tomorrow. Another reason, and this is perhaps even more abstract, is to understand systems. And this comes a lot from, before I did any of this, actually, my degree is in literary theory. And part of the thing that's exciting about that to me is it's about looking at systems and understanding them. And this is a big thing we can do when we make art with data. And the importance of this really crystallized for me this summer. I went to a conference called I/O, which is basically a conference all about data visualization and data art. And people make really cool projects like Selfie City, which is shown here, which uses metadata, both machine and human generated. So they were using Mechanical Turk people to help classify, as well as, using the geolocation on the tags. And uses all this metadata to start to understand differences between humans, right? Like, what are selfies like in Berlin versus Moscow, and what does that tell us about humanity we know? Everyone's at the conference talking about all this great stuff, but it took on a very interesting change this year where people were a little worried and a little concerned. Why? Because suddenly there were people all up in our metadata who weren't there to do art, who weren't interested in understanding us, but instead were using tools that we all loved in ways we didn't necessarily want to see them used. And it was really hard for people. People were really sad about this. And likewise, we came home and there was the Facebook newsfeed experiment, right, where they were manipulating what you saw, the emotions of what you saw, to see if they could manipulate your emotions. And a lot of people differed on whether they thought it was okay or not. Clearly, Sheryl Sandberg does not care one whit. But, it was obvious that people felt like by being reduced to data, they were being manipulated in scary ways, and that sucked. But the awesome thing is that when we make art, we take back those tools, and people can use them for bad reasons, but if we use them for the reasons to express ourselves, we're making them more ours, and we're really contributing to understanding people, and that's really, really important. The third, and far more practical reason, is you can push, understanding data visualization further by exploring novelty in a safe location. Sometimes when you try to push novelty in data visualizations, bad things happen. This is a chart showing gun deaths, and as you can see, it seems to imply that the murder rate has dropped when in fact it has increased. Well, the gun death rate, not just murder. And part of the reason this happened, of course, was because the designer was trying to communicate, this feeling of death with this blood dripping down image, and it was a great idea that ended up working out terribly. But if you do this exploration in different ways, so this is work by a woman named Georgia Lupi, and she does a lot of very artsy data visualization pieces. This covers actually the prices at which art has been sold at auction, bigger and smaller, and it's a really pretty, birds flocking kind of visualization. And she gave a talk talking about how she starts with art. This piece in the center is just a piece of art that she sketches and works with. But this is a way of using art and expressing some sort of excitement that's perhaps less dangerous and less badly done. And it's about experimenting in sort of smaller places first, and then you don't make quite the same mistakes. And of course, like I said, it's fun. We should all do fun things. And if we don't do fun things, then we can leave data and quantifiable selves to people like the happy fork, which is perhaps the worst named fork ever. If you eat too fast, it buzzes at you, and it quantifies how quickly you eat and how often you're eating. And it basically takes data and makes it not fun. Like, this is the opposite of fun. Nobody wants data to be a scold, The Apple Watch came out and like, oh yay, now you can know exactly how many steps you took. And I mean, some people are interested in that, but I don't think it really, shows tech using the full richness of us. So we should make cool stuff so that it doesn't just become a world full of happy forks. So I love examples. That's going to be probably the next third of this, is going to be looking at a bunch of different examples, which can sort of be broken down into two sections, or two types. There's literary data, where you're using sort of the same literary approach is what I like to call it, where you're using the same way that books work to work with data and to express yourself to people. And then the second way is looking at work in which words and language are the data themselves. And so we're going to talk about both. The literary approach. So you guys probably remember this picture from about 5 minutes ago. This is the traditional data visualization. You pull it all together and you look for all these stories, and these points are wrapped together to find a pattern. But when that happens, it's really hard to connect it to a human. I mean, where am I in this? Where are you? Are you average? I'm certainly not. And it's, very, very abstracted away from us. But if you think about books, literature works by getting us to identify with characters who are utterly unlike ourselves. And it does this by creating an incomplete work, just these dead words on a page, that we animate with our own imaginations. And when we do so, we start to empathize with the characters in that book. And it's a really great transformation. And we can start doing the same thing with data, using that transformation where by leaving gaps or using small anecdotal stories, people will come to identify with what you're making. So this first example we're going to look at is called First Chapters. There's actually two parts to it. It was originally done manually and using Illustrator and then re-implemented in D3. So in First Chapters, which is the originals by Stephanie Posavec, she visualizes novel openings as a series of connected sentences. The length of the line matches the length of the sentence, and they go around and around in a very pleasing layout until the end of the chapter is reached. Right? And it's an abstraction of the experience of reading the novel. Here's Hemingway, known for his brevity, and we can see his sentences are long, but the chapters end up being very short and very airy. In contrast, here's 1984, all cluttered up on top of itself, sentence upon sentence piling up. It's just as claustrophobic and dystopian as the novel itself. Third, we have The Great Gatsby, which is a bit of a different interstitial. It has some dense pieces and some open pieces, somewhat similar to the opening of that novel itself. And each of these becomes an expression of what it's like to read the novel itself, to experience its form. And then when we add JavaScript, in this case, Jim Vallandigham has made an online version of it, we can see that it's augmented even further. And it's great because not only do we get to see the sentences and engage even more deeply, but we find mistakes as well, right? In this case, the sentence is actually cut off in the wrong place, implying that it's shorter, which is a lot harder to discover if you're drawing it, although perhaps a harder mistake to make if you're drawing it as well. The next one is called A Day in the Life of a Taxi Cab. And this was made with, this is pretty much JavaScript top to bottom. They're using the node package from Mapbox, D3 on the front end for drawing, and Leaflet for serving the maps. And what it does is it visualizes the single day in the life of a taxi cab driver. And you can reload this a number of times and get a different taxi driver. And partially, right, it's to get people to empathize with the difficulty of being a taxi driver. You can see how much time you spend waiting around, where you go back and forth. You know, the money adds up over on the right there for the passengers. And there's another great option too here, which is that if you know New York at all, it lets you start to imagine who all the passengers are too, right? It's actually kind of a complex novel written in these little lines up on the screen, and it's a really great, I love this work. And another piece about it that I think is very interesting and a little bit different from traditional data visualization is that the paths that they're taking aren't actually the taxi's path. It's the Google Maps directions used to draw it out so that you can sort of experience driving around, but getting the actual GPS data was too difficult. So that's what they went ahead and did. And so it's a great opportunity, right, to be less precise but tell a better story. The next two pieces are A Day in the Life. Oh, that's the wrong title. The next pieces are Quantified Breakup and Frick Bits by Lori Frick. Also, all of these things I'm talking about, I will put up a URL at the end so you can click on all of them and play with all of them. I have a big list. So Quantified Breakup is sort of interesting. In this case, the data is the most personal. It's about a woman's divorce. You know, she has bubble charts about it, lines of support, maps of these cathartic subway ventures. But together, each chart works to crack open, you know, a piece of the author's experience that just as certainly as words on a page let us inhabit it. Totally different is Frick Bits, which just had a very successful Kickstarter. And it's the inverse. Excuse me. It's the inverse. So here she's taken traditional location data and just using you know, just using programming to make it look hand-drawn and to make your data feel more personal. Frick actually says it's a choice to make a tick mark in the column of I am not a data victim, and she talks a lot about how that drives her work here. The last piece is the timeline of neglect, which is something I made with D3. And what I'm visualizing here is, you know how you buy books and then you put them on your shelf and you never read them? So these are lines decaying as the books sit on my shelf, sort of emotionally guilting me. They'll fall apart piece by piece so that hopefully I will start reading some of them soon. And again, this, like all of them, data becomes not merely the aggregated numbers in whose patterns we seek to find ourselves, but the stuff by which we express the specifics of who we are, be it a divorcee, a taxi driver, or just somebody with a lot of book guilt. And this is the mechanism by which data becomes literary. So this theorist, Jonathan Culler, he's discussing how genres are formed, and he says, you know, he calls literature a paradoxical institution. An institution that lives by exposing and criticizing its own limits, by testing what will happen when one writes differently. And we can start pushing those limits and asking questions with our own art. You know, these are the sorts of questions people ask about literature, and you can look at these works and say, you know, who speaks when, who speaks with what authority, and you start to see really what's underlying our own experiences and deepening understanding in that way. And then, you know, this is what happens when we work with artisanal data in the realm of the aggregate. We discover what lies beneath, and it turns out that the answer is us. So another approach is to use language as data, and that's sort of creating more structural investigations versus more expressive storytelling investigations. And with this method, this is the case where there might not really be a visualization at the end, but something else, an item of play, basically. And so there's this guy, Walter Benjamin. He's also a literary theorist. He talks about sort of how impossible translation truly is, that, you know, meanings are contextual, and to take, you know, Brot for the Germans is not pan for the French. Bread is different in both of those cultures, and when you translate things, you sort of loosen the skin of meaning and cultural meaning, and by doing that, you can start to find, gaps in places where they don't match up, and then we start to understand something new and different. And we do the same sort of work when we do structural investigations, and we do it with absurdity or abstraction to, make it sort of fun. So here's Patatap, which is actually, it was made with 2.js and web audio by the creator of 2.js. And he calls it a sound animation kit. But if you play with this, there's actually little noises when you play. You type in on your keyboard, different images come up, and when you hit the space bar, you sort of change the register that things are playing in. And in a very abstract way, we can start to see a pointer right towards how just changing the register, the colors, the sound kit that you are using can really change the same letters. And what happens if you typed a novel into this, for instance? What sort of exciting things can come from this abstraction? A little less abstract are the patent generator made by Sam Levine, and then some Twitter bots, and these are made in Node. So the patent generator creates patent applications out of literature, right? Identifying structures in one and sort of shoving them into the other, and you can really see how both work. So in this case, what Sam Levine has done is he's taken the Communist Manifesto, and by identifying the structures of language that both are looked for in both cases, we can see different ways you would describe the Communist Manifesto on your patent outline. It's perhaps a system and device for springing from your present mode. I think that's a very accurate description. Or even, a device for revolutionizing the instruments. So we start to see, right, like interesting ways that both work. The same sort of thing we can see with Twitter bots. One of these is made by Tiny Subversions, Darius Kazemi, and I can't remember who the other one is by, but 2 headlines plays with the structure of news headlines. You can sort of swap out the nouns in any given news headline, and it still makes sense if in an absurd way. So, the mystery of white flags on the New York Yankees, that was actually a story about the Brooklyn Bridge. He's just swapped out a little piece of it. And likewise, the game idea machine shows a lot about how we talk about video games, I like especially a sarcastic role-playing game where you lose everything, then gain special powers to gain fabulous wealth. I think I would play that game. You might too. And then another thing that's using this for a little bit more political reasons, but very interesting ones, is the declassification engine, which historian Matthew Connolly, who works at Columbia, has been creating different projects. This is a diplomatic cables visualization that they've done, but they're doing a lot of work, which is about using the structures of redacted documents to find what the government is hiding. If you take a whole bunch of documents together and look at all the holes, it's almost, like a sort of little layered artwork where you can start picking out what's missing, and it helps the historians know what to send FOIA requests to, where to look. And this is, getting a little bit outside of art to the politics of the thing, but I think it's a really great opportunity to show, the real world application of structural investigations. So those are all of the examples. I hope some of them were really exciting for you guys and you're ready to start. So you're like, yes, I'm totally gonna leave this room, and after I go to the City Museum and have, a few drinks, I'm gonna go home and make some art, and it's gonna be great. But you're not quite sure how you want to start. How do you decide what you're going to make, right? So there's 3 ways that I tend to start generating ideas. You can start with topics, you can start with tools, or you can start with something I like to call translation. So with topics, you just start asking yourself things like, what do you love that has nothing to do with tech, right? Because it's great to bring in sort of fuzzy, strange human things into this world. So what do you love that's not like that? Or what system do you want to poke at that has assumptions you want to explore? And you're onto something when you sort of can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes, though, coming to the topic that way is a little hard. And another approach is to ask yourself, are there tools that I want to play with? And then I can start looking for data sets that are structured to match those tools, right? So online on the D3 site, there's a ton of different layouts that you can make with D3, right? You can make force layouts and all sorts of great nodes and these awesome sunbursts. And, sometimes I just go through and I'm like, I want to learn how to make that layout, so I better find some data that matches it. Likewise, there's a tool called TopoTime, which Elijah Meeks, who actually wrote one of the books that's on sale out there, about D3 has been working on. And this sits on top of D3, and it's basically a library for working with time where the time spans are uncertain. They work with historians, but you could use it with all sorts of things, even the timeline of neglect. Some books I know I just bought before other books, and it's a really great tool to mess around with. Finally, there's this pattern library, which is the Python module that they used for the patent generator. So it makes it fairly easy to take a bunch of works and start finding different phrasings that you're looking for, which is how that works. And the third way to do it, right, is translation, which is to say, can you remake something you think is beautiful, driven by data that you have, right? This is a piece of artwork that's just silver and wax by Bing Wright. But it's really beautiful, and it's the kind of thing I'd look at and say, there might be a data set somewhere where I could make really great art or something that matched this. So those are sort of the different ways you can start to look at things. And once you know what you want to do, the last part is, of course, to actually make it. So let's talk about process. You probably already make things and know a lot about process. And this kind of work is even better than doing work at work because you get to make all of the decisions and you don't have to convince clients or project managers or anybody that what you're doing is right. But you'll find that the process is somewhat similar. I like to start with sketching. So here's the piece that I mentioned before that Georgia Lupi's work started with. She talked a little bit about how she likes to go out and just look at pretty artworks and just redraw them again, to get her brain juices flowing. Also, you can just do the kind of sketching, where you're trying to figure out what you want to do just to iterate really quickly. It's fun and it's nice because if you mess up like a sketch, you can just throw it away and you don't, it just never happened. And then once you know what you want to make, you can gather your data. And remember, this part doesn't have to be perfect. For my book pieces, all I've done is, sat there with like Excel typing things into a CSV. It's, it doesn't have to be perfect, which makes it really exciting. And then there's step 3, which is the most important step, which is to test, to fail, to try again. You will do something and it will not work the way that you wanted it to work, I promise, It's like if your code runs right the first time, you're always really surprised. This is kind of like that. It's not going to be what you thought. And this image is actually a great doodle by a woman named Jo Bradshaw to illustrate a tweet by Marcus Romer talking about the creative process, which essentially goes, this is awesome, this is tricky, this is shit, I am shit, this might be okay, this is awesome. And you will get back to this is awesome, but this is definitely, I think, the hardest part about doing it. And, here's a good example, which is this thing on the left is a sketch that I made. I wanted to make some radial dot piece. This thing on the right is what actually happened. They look absolutely nothing alike whatsoever, but I love what ended up happening, and that's sort of, right, as you iterate and push through each wall, you will eventually, I promise, come up with something that was the right thing after all. Likewise, there's a lot of really, really great resources on the web, particularly for D3. There's 2 books, Interactive Data Visualization and D3.js in Action. Scott's book is perhaps a little bit more beginning if you've never messed around with D3 before. It's also available free online, and I have a link to that. Elijah Meeks is the sort of more intermediate level. There's some great blog posts by women like Irene Rose and Shirley Wu, and if you're lucky enough to live in or be in San Francisco, there's a foundation called GAFTA, the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, and they actually just took over a huge old theater in the Mission to have classes and meetups and exhibitions and just all sorts of work around this kind of data art that I really recommend. It's great. And then there's step 4, right, which is share. Once you make it work, share it, show it to people, see if it resonates. And remember, this is art. It doesn't have to be popular. People don't have to love it. But I think if you start off being you and making stuff you love, eventually you'll find the audience that loves it too. So, that's it. Ask questions, poke at stuff, make your computer do hard work for you. express your incomplete truths and share them eventually. And if you keep doing that, your understanding will grow and mine will grow, and we will all be awesome together. So thank you so much.